Hi everybody, I'm going to be talking you through all of the theory from themes 1 and 3 for the exam that's happening on Thursday this week. This is the format for the exam. The main thing to say before I start is that you mustn't forget to take your cup of tea into the exam with you. 3 really fundamental things that you need to do throughout the exam. You need to remember T for timing, make sure that you're doing a mark a minute. E for explain, everything that you say you need to explain as you're going along. And A is for apply. You need to use the data where appropriate and or to include examples as well. So first of all, theme 1. Economics as a social science. This is about the fact that when you are finding things out and proving things and making theories in economics, you have to make a lot of assumptions because you're dealing with people and you're dealing with lots of variables which you can't control for. So one of the assumptions that we often make is ceteris paribus, and this means in Latin, all else remains the same. So you're assuming that you're only changing one factor at a time and that everything else stays the same. The other thing about economics as a social science is that we're looking at people and people within businesses and within government and consumers. And this is about people's emotions and how they feel, and this will affect how they behave. We can't assume that people will behave in a certain way, and this makes economics a social science, and also it's harder to predict what's going to happen. So overall, experiments in economics aren't scientific because they're to do with so many variables and to do with people. Positive and normative statements. So a positive statement is one that can be proven right or wrong using evidence, whereas a normative statement is something that can't be proven right or wrong using evidence because it's a value judgment. And this has an influence in people's decision making, whether they are doing things which are fact or they're doing things that they think that they should do. And also on policy that's being made by government, because they might be looking at things that are definite or they're looking at opinions from different people and value judgments that are being made in given situations. The basic economic problem is that there are infinite wants and scarce resources, and therefore decisions have to be made according to that. And we have to decide what to produce, how to produce it, and who it should be produced for, given the scarce resources. We learn about renewable and non-renewable resources. Renewable are ones that when they're used, they can be replenished and then used again, whereas non-renewable, once they've been used, that's the end, and they can't be used again. The 3 economic agents are consumers, firms, and the government, and sometimes also considered an economic agent is the environment. Production possibility frontiers. These show the maximum possible output of 2 goods when all factors of production are fully and efficiently employed. If you're moving along the production possibility frontier, you will be showing an opportunity cost, because if you use the factors of production to produce more of one item, then it means that you can't make as much of the other one. If the PPF shifts outwards, that means there's been an improvement in the quality and or quantity of the factors of production, and the productive potential has increased. If the PPF shifts inwards, there's been a decrease in the quality and or quantity of the factors of production, and there's been a decrease in the productive potential of the economy. If the PPF shifts outwards, we have potential economic growth. If you are at a coordinate within the PPF and you move closer to the PPF, that is real economic growth. There's been an increase in output. Capital goods are goods which can be used to produce other goods, and capital goods are considered to be machines generally. Consumer goods are products that consumers are using, for instance, a t-shirt. If you are inside the PPF, that's attainable. Also on the PPF is attainable. If you're outside the PPF, that's unattainable because you have insufficient factors of production to be operating there. If you're inside the PPF, that means that some of the factors of production aren't being fully and efficiently employed. Specialisation and the division of labour. Adam Smith was an economist who wrote a lot about this, and there are many advantages of individuals or firms, areas of country, in specialising in one product in particular. And if within an organisation a person specialises in one item of the production process, then you'll have the division of labour. Different people within an organisation are doing different tasks. The main advantage of this is that if each person specialises in one thing, then they'll get better at that task. People can be selected to do what they are best at. This will increase their productivity, that's labour productivity, output per worker per time period. And if labour productivity increases, this means that cost per unit decreases and firms can make more profits per unit. The main disadvantages of specialisation by individuals is that if one person is absent from the organisation, then they won't be able to do their part of the production process and the whole process can break down. Also, people can get bored of the task that they're doing, and you may get more absences from the workplace, people taking more breaks. And sometimes, because people are specializing and it becomes repetitive, the boredom actually makes them less productive and productivity can fall. Also, if you have the specialization of people or businesses or areas in a certain item and they're only making one thing, then in order for people to be able to have a range of things, you'll need to have trade of those things. Money developed so that you don't need to have barter and you don't need to have a coincidence of wants. You don't have to find somebody else who wants what you have, who has the thing that you want. So therefore, money is a medium of exchange. We trust that we will be able to exchange money for items. It's a store of value in that you can have some money today and you can use it a month, 2 months, 2 years later. It stores value. And as well as that, it allows you to compare the value of different items. So you can say that a shirt that's £10 is worth 2 shirts, which are only £5. And you can compare items in this way. And it's also a method of deferred payment, which means that you can make an arrangement to pay for something in future. You can say that you'll pay £100 in the future, and you can use the money in the future to pay the £100, and we trust that the money will be worth the same then, or at least that it will still be the amount that needs to be paid. Because of inflation, it might not actually be worth the same amount of money. Types of economy. There are 3 main types. The free market economy is what Friedrich Hayek believed in, and this means that the economy determines the allocation of resources using the free market completely, which is demand and supply. If you have a controlled economy, which is what Karl Marx believed in, a control economy means that the government controls the allocation of resources completely, and they decide who has which factors of production. Adam Smith, easy to remember because Smith is quite a common name, it's more middle of the road. That's a mixed economy. That's where there's some degree of government intervention, but the free market also allocates resources. In the UK, we're in a mixed economy. The more free market economy might be somewhere like the US or Singapore. A control economy somewhere like North Korea is in the extreme, where the government are controlling all of the factors of production. Rational decision making. This is something that we assume in economics, but it isn't always the case. We assume that consumers want to maximize their utility, which is the benefit they get from something, and we assume that producers, firms, want to maximize profits. Demand, this is effective demand, is the quantity that somebody or a group of people are willing and able to buy at a given price. The demand curve is downward sloping. There's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, and this can be explained by the law of diminishing marginal utility. that with each additional item that somebody consumes, they get less utility. And therefore, for higher quantities, people are less likely to pay as much money, so they pay a lower price. A movement along a demand curve is to do with a change in price, so it just shows you at different prices the difference in the quantity demanded. If the whole demand curve shifts, that means that at the same price, more or less is demanded than before. The determinants of demand, the acronym PIRATE, so these are things that shift the whole demand curve. P for population, I for income, R for related goods, so that's the price of substitutes and complements, A for advertising, T for tastes, and E for expectations of changes in price. So if people think that the price of something will go up in future, they're much more likely to buy it now, and demand would increase now. Price, income, and cross elasticities. So you need to know the formulas for these and to be able to do calculations. The formulas, remember that the quantity demanded or supplied is always on the top line. For the calculations, you need to know percentage change. So the formulas, so if price elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. Income elasticity of demand is percentage change of demand divided by percentage change in income. And cross elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded of good A divided by percentage change in the price of good B. Remember, a percentage change is the change over the original times 100, or new minus old over the original times 100. If something's elastic, that means a percentage change leads in, for example, price leads to a greater percentage change in quantity demanded. And if something's elastic, the value will be greater than 1. Remember to cover up any negative signs. Inelastic means for PED that the percentage change in price leads to a smaller percentage change in quantity demanded. And if something's inelastic, that will mean that the value is less than 1. Again, remember to cover up any negative signs. If something is perfectly elastic, then it will be a horizontal line and the value will be infinity. If it's perfectly inelastic, it will be a vertical line and the value will be 0. If it's unitary, that's where you have a 45-degree line from the origin, that value is 1, and that means a percentage change in one factor leads to an equal percentage change in the other factor. And if there's no relationship, the value will be 0. PED determinants, these are whether there are substitutes available, the amount of time available, the definition of the product, and P is for the proportion of income that's being spent on the product. So if there are a lot of substitutes available, then the PED will be more elastic. If there is a lot of time available to look for substitutes, then the PED will be elastic. If the definition of the product is very wide, so for instance, food, the PED would be very inelastic. But if you're just talking about potatoes in a country where other carbohydrates are available, the definition is really narrow, and that would mean that there are many substitutes and the PED would be very elastic. Proportion of income, if you're spending a very small proportion of your income on something, then your PED will be very inelastic because it's very cheap to you, and therefore even if its price goes up, you'll still be buying a lot of it. PED and revenue, if your PED is inelastic, you need to put up the price to increase revenue. If PED is elastic, you need to decrease price to increase revenue. YED, this is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in income. If you have a normal good, the YED will be positive value. If you have an inferior good, the YED will be a negative value. And a luxury good is where you have more income, you're buying more of it as well, but at higher quantities when people have higher incomes. XED is where you have percentage change in quantity demanded of good A divided by percentage change in price of good B, and complements will have a negative XED, substitutes will have a positive XED. Also with YED and XED, you can also look at whether they are elastic or inelastic values. This time cover up any negative sign, and if the value is greater than 1, it's elastic. If it's less than 1, it is inelastic. Supply, a movement along the supply curve. This is looking at quantity supplied at different prices and what the quantity will be. This is a positive correlation. So as price increases, quantity supplied increases. If you're moving along the curve, this is due to changes in price. If you shift the curve, you're at the same price, but you are supplying more or supplying less. The determinants of supply, CRUs, are costs to the business, regulations, expectations of changes in costs, weather, and subsidies. And also indirect taxes will also change the supply. Price elasticity of supply, the formula for this is percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. Again, you need to know how to work out a percentage change, and that's change divided by original times 100. Be careful of whether there's any negative signs in there. The determinants of price elasticity of supply, SFA. So this is whether for the business, if you have stocks, then that would make your PES more elastic. If you have factors of production available to use, which aren't being used at the moment, that makes your PES more elastic. And A is the amount of time. The more time you have, the more elastic the PES. The short run and long run in economics. In the short run, this means at least one factor is fixed. In the long run, all factors of production are variable. And therefore, for price elasticity of supply, in the short run, when at least one factor is fixed, the PES will be more inelastic. In the long run, when all factors can be variable, the PES will be more elastic. Price determination. So the equilibrium price happens where demand is equal to supply. Excess demand is where the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. That will be below the equilibrium price. Excess supply is where the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and that will be above the equilibrium price. What the price mechanism does, if there's excess demand, it will increase the price to get rid of the excess demand. If there's excess supply, it will lower the price to get rid of the excess supply. If the demand increases, it shifts to the right. If supply increases, it shifts to the right. If demand or supply decrease, they shift to the left. Left is less. And this will impact the three main economic agents differently, depending on the situation that they're in, because prices will go up or down when demand and or supply shift. The price mechanism does three things in particular. It rations signals and is an incentive. Rationing is where there are insufficient products, whatever they may be, and by rationing, if there's excess demand for something, the price mechanism causes the price to go up, and this will mean that the good is then rationed because only people who can afford the higher price will be able to pay it. Signaling is when the price changes and it signals to, for instance, producers to produce more if the price goes up. Incentive is where the increase or decrease in price makes people want to consume more or supply more in the case of firms, or less in either case. But it's what's making consumers or firms behave in a certain way, the price being different. And you can look at the price mechanism in many different markets. for instance, the rice market, the housing market, to see how changes in demand and supply can affect the price. Consumer and producer surplus. For consumers, this is the difference between the price the consumer was willing and able to pay for the product and the price they do pay. For the producer, it's the difference between the price they were willing and able to sell the product at and the price that they pay. On a diagram, it's a triangle. Always start on the y-axis at the price that you're dealing with. Go to the equilibrium, move along the relevant curve for consumers' demand, for producers' supply, up to make your triangle, and then back to your original point. In the question, be careful, are they asking for the old surplus, the new surplus, or the change in the surplus? Indirect taxes and subsidies. Indirect taxes cause the supply curve to shift to the left. If it's a specific tax, then it will be a parallel shift. If it's an ad valorem tax, it will be a pivot. With a subsidy, this is money being given by the government to a firm. This causes supply to increase, so supply shifts to the right. Again, it could be a specific subsidy or an ad valorem subsidy, and you need to do the shift accordingly. On the diagram, always start at your new equilibrium, go to the old supply curve and make your rectangle, split the rectangle using the old equilibrium. For indirect taxes, the top box is consumers, the bottom producers for the tax burdens. And for subsidies, you switch them over. The top box is producers, the bottom box is consumers, and that's the benefit that they receive from the subsidy. In both cases, if you add together the consumer and producer boxes, you get, for indirect taxes, the total tax revenue collected. For subsidies, you get the total subsidy paid by the government. Alternative views of consumer behavior. So people don't always behave rationally. Firstly, they may well be influenced by others' behavior. Sometimes we call this herd mentality. Habitual behavior is where somebody's in the habit of doing something. They're suffering from inertia. They're stuck with what they're doing because they're used to it. And also, consumers can have trouble with working out what's the best option for them and which will maximize their utility. So they have weakness at computation. There are three different types of market failure. Market failure is where the price mechanism results in a net welfare loss and a misallocation of resources. The three types of market failure are due to externalities, which could be positive or negative, under provision of public goods, and also information gaps. Externalities, these can be positive or negative, and you will be looking, for the purpose of the specification, at where you have a diagram. You could be showing externalities which are negative from production, or you could draw a diagram which is showing externalities which are positive from consumption. You can also talk about positive externalities from production and negative externalities from consumption, but the diagrams are only for the first two that I mentioned. Remember that the free market level of output is where the marginal private cost equals marginal private benefit, and the socially optimum level of output is where the marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. You can always find your deadweight welfare loss or net weight welfare loss by starting at your free market level of output and continuing your dotted line up, and that will give you the triangle that you need. The government intervention that might occur will affect different parties because it may well change the level of output. It might reduce the net welfare loss, and it might get us closer to the socially optimum level of output. Public goods, these have to be meeting two criteria to be public goods. They need to be non-excludable, which means that nobody can be excluded from consuming them, and they need to be non-rival, which means that one person consuming the good doesn't prevent another person from doing so. So an example of a public good is a street light. If they only meet one of the criteria, then they are a quasi-public good. The free rider problem is that because of a public good being non-excludable and non-rival, this means that somebody can use the public good without having to pay for it, and therefore some people will be doing that. A private good is a good which is excludable and rival. For example, an apple. Somebody has to pay to have it, so therefore it's excludable if they can't afford the apple, and it's rival because if one person eats the apple, nobody else can eat that apple. Public goods are often provided by the government because people vote for policies where the government say they'll provide them, because the free market is unlikely to provide public goods. Due to the free rider problem, there is no profit motive because they will find it hard or impossible to make any profits because people will use the product without paying for it. Information gaps are the third type of market failure, and this is where one party to a transaction has more information than the other party, and therefore they make decisions that they wouldn't have made if they'd have had the same amount of information. Symmetric information is where it's symmetrical, both sides have the same amount of information. Asymmetric is where they have different amounts. So this would be like going to the dentist and the dentist tells you you need dental work done, which is not true, but you don't know any different because you're not a dental expert, and therefore you pay to have that dental work which you didn't actually need. Government can then intervene in markets if there is market failure to try and correct it. If the government intervenes, they can use different methods, and you could show these either on their own diagram or an externalities diagram. They can put an indirect tax onto a product, which can be specific or ad valorem, and this should decrease consumption of the product. However, if the PED of the product is very inelastic, it may have a small impact. They can also put a subsidy on a good to try and increase consumption of it, where it's generating positive externalities. You could show this on an externalities diagram or on a subsidies diagram, which is the same with the indirect taxes. You can show it using an indirect taxes diagram or an externalities diagram. With a subsidy, this would be increasing the amount of consumption of something and therefore decreasing a net welfare loss where it's generating positive externalities. The government could put in place a maximum or minimum price for a product, and you could use the specific diagram for each of these. A maximum price would be saying the government think that the current price is too high and a maximum price is below the equilibrium. They're saying we think that this is the maximum price this should be sold for, and this can result in excess demand for something, which can lead to waiting lists, first come, first serve, and just general problems with how you allocate something. A minimum price can be where the government think that the price isn't high enough. A minimum price will be set above the equilibrium because they think the equilibrium is too low. This might be where they think producers selling the product aren't receiving enough money, like farmers, and they think they should get more than the equilibrium, or it's because they think there's too much consumption of a product at the equilibrium price, for instance, alcohol. So they put in place this minimum price above the equilibrium. A minimum price can result in excess supply of the product. If it's to do with, for instance, farmers and them receiving enough money, the government may purchase the excess supply. If it's to do with reducing consumption of something like alcohol, the businesses will realize that the excess won't be purchased. Tradable pollution permits can be set up where you want to reduce negative externalities from production of something. The government will try and work out what the socially optimum level of output is of the product and the socially optimum level of pollution, therefore. And they will allocate permits or perhaps sell them at a low price at the beginning so that businesses receive a permit which allows them to pollute at a certain level. If they go over that allowance, they will be fined. If they go under the allowance, they can sell the excess. So there's a profit motive for the firms to produce less pollution because they make a profit out of selling the excess permit allowance. The government might provide public goods as a way of solving that form of market failure. And this will mean things like streetlight, the police and defence are provided by the government. The government might provide information where there's a lack of information, and this should reduce asymmetric information in markets so that people are less likely to make uninformed decisions which generate a net welfare loss. Finally, the government could put in place regulations, and the regulation would be to limit or stop a certain action of production or consumption so that we get closer to the socially optimum level of output. Government failure occurs where the government intervene in the market, but actually it then still results in a net welfare loss. This might be because the government's action distorts the price signals. So actually they're completely distorting the free market. If they put an indirect tax in place, this will increase the price above the equilibrium price. If they put a subsidy in place, it will decrease the price below the equilibrium price. A maximum price will distort the price mechanism because the price will be below the equilibrium. A minimum price will distort the price mechanism because a minimum price will be above the equilibrium. There can also be unintended consequences. For example, it might be expensive to set up the government intervention. It might be very expensive to monitor it. It also might result in smuggling, and it can result in an informal transaction outside what the government is aware of, so that things are being bought and sold illegally, for example, without taxes being placed. There can be excessive administrative costs for the government. There'll be an opportunity cost there because the money they spend on the administration could have been used for something else. Also, there can be information gaps. So the government don't know exactly what the socially optimum level of output is. They can't measure precisely the positive or negative externalities, and they can't place a monetary value on those. Also, they might not be fully aware of what a company or an individual is doing, and therefore there are gaps in the information which make it more likely that when the government intervenes, there will be government failure. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about everything from theme 3, which can be included in paper 1.